Welcome to the Savage Productions YouTube channel.
Hey, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining us today. Today we are actually putting together, or starting to put together, a LS3 4/16 stroker. So we had a customer come in a while back. He had an issue with this LS3, had a broken lifter. So what we ended up doing was we pulled it apart. We planned on just replacing the lifters, but we kind of figured he might have damaged the cam. And of course it did. It damaged the cam. All the lifters were damaged. They were starting to get mushroomed. And so we also ended up finding out that two of the cylinders were scarred up really bad. So we ended up, we pulled the motor out. The customer decided to go ahead and do a complete rebuild with a 4/16 stroker kit. So we sent it off, we totally disassemble it, send it off to the machine shop. Even though this is an aluminum block, it does have sleeves in it, and it was a standard bore. You could take them over a little bit. So with this particular kit, it was bored over 10 thousandths of an inch, and it's a complete stroker, 4-inch stroke with the rods, pistons. We even got the pistons with some more valve reliefs because of the cam that we're going to put in it. We're going with a stage 4 Brian Tooley cam. We're going to do the complete kit with springs, locks, retainers, push rods, new lifters. So anyway, we get the block back. At this point, what I'm doing is I'm just checking for clearance. I want to make sure we're not going to have any issues with rod bolts coming in contact with the bottom of the cylinder wall. A lot of times on any motor, if you go with a stroker kit, a bigger stroke crank, you may have issues with that. The LS3's got a lot of clearance in them. You generally, on a 4-inch stroke, you generally don't have to clearance them. But with the size of these rods, these are I-beams, but they're very strong, forged 4340. Between the crank and the rods and these pistons, this thing will handle quite a bit of power. It's probably going to handle somewhere around 1,000 horsepower. We're going with ARP screwed in studs for the mains. I've already gone and assembled the pistons and the rods together. These are full floating pins on here. They actually have these C-clips instead of spiral locks that came with these. A lot of times you'll have spiral locks that you'll put on, or C-clips. This one comes with C-clips. These are a lot easier to put on. You put 2 per side. But anyway, as far as the on these pistons and the rods here, you want to make sure when you put them on that you put them on in the right direction. The valves reliefs are always up on the intake side, not on the exhaust side. The intakes, generally the valves come down and hit right about here. So you want to make sure you have them angled the correct way. And then also, the rods, usually, if you're looking at it from the bottom, you have a tapered part of the rod, you have a flat part of the rod. This is generally how it's going to be on the crank. So see how the rods, or your valve reliefs, are on the top, on both of them. And if you notice, you have a flat section, and then that one's a flat section. There's no bevel there. Those are the ones that's going to go together on the crankshaft, just like that. The beveled section always goes towards the crank. You got the main journals for the main bearings, main caps, and then you have the rod journals. Okay, if you look at the journals, you can see on the side here, it's got a little bevel. I mean, it's not cut straight. It's actually rounded off, and that's the way all of them are. When you put a rod on, see that bevel there? You have to make sure that the bevel is on the side of the crank. It's kind of interesting when you put all these together. They all end up going together the same exact way, and I'll show you here on the table. Once you know the direction of the rod, which way it has to go on a piston, you can put all of them on in the same fashion. These are manufactured by DSS, really good pistons, and then the rods are the same way. So when they balance them, they just get all pistons together. They get the lightest piston. They start taking a little bit of metal out of all the other pistons. They just get them all weighed the same. Then they get all the rods weighed the same. And at that point, you don't have to worry about matching a piston with a rod when they're matched up that way. I check them. You know, I'll number them, which one goes where, because, you know, obviously this side's going to face one way, this side's going to face the other. That's 1 and 2. So you want to make sure you number them. And once you do that, you can just start putting it together. I got one more I want to put together just to show you. It's pretty simple. And then we're going to check for some clearance. All right, well, at this point, we obviously want to make sure that when we put this rod on, we put it on the correct way, like I was just saying. So if we just follow the rest of these pistons, see every one of them, the numbers are on the left. And when the numbers are on the left, the valve reliefs are on the same side, they're on the bottom. And then also too, you notice how this rod, all these rods have numbers on them on one side. I don't know if you can see that. On the other side, they don't have any numbers on them. Generally, the numbers, when you put a motor together, let's say you stick this piston down in the hole, the number always faces up. So I'm going to just do the same thing here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put the clips on one side. Just get these in here like so. I'm going to go ahead and put it in, squeeze it. You just want to make sure that you're in the groove. I'll just use just a chrome socket that's not all burred up. I even put a little bit of lube on it from my bearing lube, just so it doesn't nick anything up. It's slick. And I'll just push against there. And like I said, it takes 2 of them per side. So I got the first one in, I'm going to do the second one. And you can do it any way you want. I like to do, obviously you got the 2 holes. I'll put 2 holes down on the first one, and then on the second one I'll put 2 holes up. Squeeze it, I'll put it in there. Make sure it's in the grooves on the bottom first, and then I'll just push that in. See, I heard it click. Now if you had the ones that had the spiral locks, those are a little bit more of a pain. You know, you still put 2 spiral locks in per side, and you generally have to spread them apart. They're almost like a spring. You spread them apart, then you have to work them in, and they'll pop in, and then you have to do the second one the same way. These are so much easier. They really are. So after I get that done, I want to get a little bit of this is just bearing assembly lubes. All it is, you can put 30 weight, whatever, any type of motor oil on there if you want. But this stuff works really good. So I want to just put a little bit in here. Sometimes I'll go ahead and just put them in before I even do the clips. I probably should have did that on this one side anyway. So anyway, I get those lubed up. And then these are, you can see the brass bushings that's in them. They've already been honed out to proper size for these pins. So I'm going to lube this up too. Go ahead and lube the pin up a little bit. Then I'm going to get the pin and start it on the side I don't have the clips in. Just have to be real easy with it. Try not to, it goes in perfect, so there's no sense in forcing it. And now at this point, I want to just lay the pistons exactly how the other ones are. The numbers are on this side. I got my number 8 marked here. And then the rods, you see the rods, there's no writing on this side of the rod. They're on the other side of the rod, not here. So I'm going to do this rod the same way. There's no writing on it. I'll just put it in there nice and easy. Slips in. Got to make sure it's good and straight, because these things are very, very tight fit. I mean, they're not tight per se, but the tolerance is. So you got to make sure that you're going in 100% straight, or it will hang up on you. be all the way in. Yep. Now I want to get the other one on the bottom. Since I put the other two holes on the top, it doesn't really matter. I just like to do them that way. It went in, I could tell it went right in, but just for the heck of it, I like to check it. And that's it. I mean, that's pretty much how you do it. Something else you have to keep an eye out. I want to just show you on this one. Rod bearings. Obviously, you want to make sure that there's no oil or anything on this side of the bearing. When you put that bearing in, you want to make sure that's totally clean of oil. You know? And also, you want to make sure that the bearing itself is clean of oil. So what I usually do, I'm just showing you this for now, but what I do is after doing this, I clean my hands, make sure I have no oil on my hands. The thing is, you don't want any oil, you really don't want no oil on the back of this bearing. You don't want any oil here. It locks in with this little lock. Okay, if you can see that or not. There's a little lock there. There's a little groove there. It locks in, so you don't want no oil on the back side. Once you get it in, you can always lubricate the bearing face, you know, that's all good. So, but what I want to do, I want to show you something here that a lot of guys may not realize. You have these two bearings, you have a lower bearing and an upper bearing. So you want to make sure you get these on right. This one I just put on the wrong way. That lock on one bearing is closer to the edge than the other bearing. This bevel, this bearing is sitting too close to the bevel that way. It's actually overlapping that bevel right there. Now remember, this goes against the crankshaft. Now this side that goes against the rod, even though it has a little bit of a bevel, that doesn't mean anything. But that's the flat part that goes against the rod. And look at all that space there between that bearing and there. So let me put the other one. This one here actually goes on the cap. This bearing is designed for this cap. Let me get that off of there. Okay, here's the matching bearing for that. This bearing, that groove is a lot closer this way. So it's going to make this bearing go further away from that bevel. So when you put this on, see how it's locking in there? Now look at it. You have a bevel, and that bearing is actually away from that bevel about 1/16 of an inch. That way you don't have that bearing rubbing on the side of that crankshaft. And it puts the bearing closer to this side, on the flat side. There's still a little bit of a gap there. That's fine, because you don't want that all the way on the outside. You don't want it rubbing on that other rod that's laying up against it. And then this bearing is designed to go on the cap. Does the same thing. See, you have an actual, you have more of a gap on this side, on that bevel side, and then this one is closer to the flat side. So what happens is, if you happen to put this one on the rod and you put the one that goes on the rod on the cap, the bearings are going to be, you know, on the wrong side, and they'll prematurely start wearing into the crank, and that's not a good thing. So this is the way that they come. These bearings come in two cases. They came in this case, and they came in this case. One case is for the rods, one case is for the cap. Another thing a lot of people don't realize, you know, they look the same unless you happen, you know, actually paid attention and seen where that groove was located on there. So another thing, let's say you just start putting these bearings, you know, you grab this bearing, you put it on the cap, you grab the next one in line, you put it on the rod. Well, when you do that, now the bearings, they'll actually be staggered. One bearing will be you know, depends on which one you go with. I mean, one bearing would be right, but then the other bearing would be wrong, and they won't even line up right. So that's really important, that you want to make sure you put the right bearings where they go. Now that's not the case for every motor. You know, that's just the way that they're making the bearings now. These rods, they have this lip in here that protrudes down into the rod. Usually I'll put a little bit of oil around there, and when you put them together, once you get it on there and put them together, you want to make sure that you do it perfectly straight. You take your time. You know, they say really not to pull them in with the bolt. You want to kind of use a little rubber mallet. Once you put the bolts in, you know, let's just pretend this is already on the crank. You basically put it in there. You get these started. See how it kind of walks? You want to make sure it's kind of straight. Get your little rubber mallet and just barely tap it in. And tap it evenly as it goes in. And once you get it in so far, then you can take these on in. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so I tried setting the camera up on the tripod, but couldn't get a good view. So I'm going to hold this camera, kind of show you what we're doing here. So I basically put number 7 and number 8 piston in. I don't have rings on them. I got everything oiled up. I got bearing lube on them. I don't have these torqued down. I just got them snug. I just wanted to rotate the crank around to make sure we have good clearance on the rod bolts, or even the tips and the corners of these rods. And basically what you want to look at is the bottom of the cylinder wall. You see that? The rod bolt right there. So you have, that's the bottom of the cylinder wall, and you want to get to the closest point of rotation and check your clearance between there. Typically any moving parts in a motor, you generally want about 60 thousandths clearance. That's about, you know, the average. You know, you can get 50 thousandths is fine too, but they really say 60 thousandths. So this one has got about 75 to 80. It really looks like it's close, but I did check it. We've got about 80 thousandths clearance between the bottom of that cylinder wall and either the tip of this bolt or even the corner right here of the rod. So we do have good clearance. If this was a longer stroke crank, we would have to clearance this block right here on the bottom of the cylinder wall. You generally just have to, you just want to make a mark, and we usually use a porting tool just to kind of round it off, and you only take off as much as you need to get at least 60 thousandths clearance, a little more. Machine shops actually have a machine that does it for you. A lot easier, but you know, costs money to do that. This is something you could do yourself if you was doing a stroker kit, whether it's a Chevy, Ford, Dodge, it doesn't matter, import. You just want to kind of sit the crank in. You don't necessarily have to put the caps on and torque them down. Just make sure everything's lubed up real good. You don't want to lift the crank up. You just want to barely turn it real slow so you don't scar up the bearings. You want to make sure they're all lubed up good. I use the bearing assembly lube for that. And then put these rods on, just like I said, if you were putting the motor together. I don't have them torqued, but I got them snugged a little bit. I don't have rings on the pistons. I got everything lubricated so they slide up and down easy. You know, you want to check other places. There's a lot of other places, like for instance, in between the counterweight and the block right here. You can see these are really close. Even though it's not a part, you know, that's rotating this way against it, it's rotating with it, you know, just kind of rotating around. You definitely want to check clearance there. There's a couple places, you know, that's a little bit tighter than what I would like, but you know, I actually checked, talked to the manufacturer, and they said that's enough clearance. So I'm getting about 25 thousandths clearance between the actual block and the counterweight, and I've got one
place that's 15 thousandths. Now the only time that's going to come into that you're going to have a problem is obviously your thrush bearing. So usually the middle main cap is your thrush bearing. That's where you have, not only do you have a bearing here, you have a bearing between here and the crank. Right there is actually the thrush bearing. There's one on that side and there's one on that side. I've got these caps lubricated up and put on. So you can see the difference in the caps. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. One being the front. So you can see these are just regular bearings, regular main bearings. The one in the center is a thrush bearing. It's all one piece. Basically, instead of having just regular bearing, it's got sides to it. And the sides, it basically squeezes down on there. You have a side on this one and on this one. And not only do you have it on the cap, you have it on the block side too. So that's your thrush bearing, and what that does is it keeps the crank centered front to back. So you also, once you set all this in, torque the caps down, you want to check the end play on your crank. Generally you have somewhere around 1.5 to 2 thousandths is where they normally start out, and as mileage happens, let's say you have a 100,000 mile motor, you may end up with a little bit more than that. Stick shift cars, they will wear the thrush bearing out prematurely, especially if you're racing it. If you're basically doing hard launches on a two-step, it will prematurely wear those out. That's why it's important to use a forged crankshaft, and you want to definitely use good high performance racing bearings, because if you do that, they will not wear out prematurely. So just imagine with the clearance being so tight. So if you end up having that thrush bearing wear out and you have 20 thousandths of movement front to back, you got to know it before any other issues. Obviously if that thrush bearing starts to wear out, the crank's going to move front to back, and you'll start having issues with oil pressure. Actually, you'll see oil pressure dropping when you push the clutch in. So, but anyway, everything checks out here. We got plenty of clearance between the rod bolts and the cylinder wall. So I haven't checked the other ones, but typically if you have clearance on 2 cylinders, the other ones are going to be the same. I mean, they're going to be the same, probably won't be no more, no less. But I'm going to check them before I go ahead and start assembling everything. I'm going to go ahead, I've got all, that's one reason why I went ahead and got all the rods and pistons together and without the rings on them. I'm going to go ahead and lubricate the cylinders, get everything lubricated up, and I'm going to put them in and make sure I have no clearance issues, because I'd hate to start putting this thing together and then find that I've got 1 or 2 that's too close and I got to pull all back apart again. So I'm going to check that first, and once I see that I'm good on the clearance, which I'm pretty sure it's going to be fine, then we are going to start assembling this thing. So they actually all checked out really good. I went ahead and filed 1 set of rings on cylinder 2. I went ahead and got that. The rings on the pistons, got the piston in, got that one torqued down. I went ahead and started putting in the side bolts for the main caps. Yeah, so like we talked about, we checking all the clearancing on this thing. Everything checked out fine. I went ahead and I have the number 2 piston and rod in place. I got it lubed up. I've got it torqued down to the specs for these ARP bolts. So these are 7/16 8740 ARPs and 68 foot-pounds. I usually do them in about 3 steps. You want to go back and forth on each side real slow so the cap sinks down evenly. And I even checked rotation on the bottom of the piston to make sure we had plenty of clearance on the crank. No problem there. The other thing I did and I went ahead and put these side bolts in. You know, this is 6-bolt main caps. These are all torqued down to the specs. And then after these are all torqued down, you want to put the side bolts in. So I've got all the side bolts in, and they're all torqued down except one I wanted to show you. These came in the kit, ARP, 10mm head. And basically what you want to do, I just put a little bit of lube, ARP lube on the tip of it, and then on the inside of the head here you want to put a little bit of silicone. I always use the ultra gray on just about everything. Put a little bit on there. You want to just hand tighten it, let it sit up for about 5 or 10 minutes, maybe 15, and then you can go ahead and torque it down. That way it won't leak. Because if you don't put silicone in there, you generally will have an oil leak going on. The factory bolts on these LS motors actually have, I should say the factory side bolts, they actually have a ring, a little bit of a ring on them that seals them. And I know guys have reused them before, and they usually put silicone on them if they reuse them. So I've been using the ARP lube on all the ARP bolts, so just put a little bit on there. It really isn't that critical on these. They don't even tell you to put this on because these things only tighten up to 20 foot-pounds, which isn't very much, but I'm sure it's not going to get much of a stretch on 20 foot-pounds. I usually take them to about 25. I mean, these are definitely strong bolts. They can, you don't want to go too much on the side bolts, but I just think 25 foot-pounds is not too much. It just feels a little bit better to get a little bit more torque to it than 20 foot-pounds. And then I'll just put a little bit of silicone on. Try not to be too messy, but I guess it don't matter. I'll just run them in by hand. I just take it up here until it's snug. And then I'll let that sit for at least 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and start gapping some rings. I've got the rings kind of laid out here. These rings are actually oversized, so you have to gap the rings on this particular setup. And we're gapping them for pretty much a performance motor, not so much a street, more of a performance motor, and also nitrous, because you might end up running some nitrous. We're not going to go too crazy on the gap. We're going to be around 22 thousandths on the top. That's really, it's 20 to 22 is where we're shooting for, and 22 to 24 on the second ring is what we're shooting for. So that's going to be about perfect for what he's going to be doing with this motor. Obviously, I don't have a ring filer. It'd be nice to have one, but I've done it like this for years. You just have to be real careful, do a little bit at a time. You don't want to take too much off, because if you take too much off, you might as well throw it away and get another set, or at least get a new ring if you can get one. Alright, so another thing too is when you file these, especially if you use a bench grinder like this, you don't want to lay it on there and get it too hot. You know, this does have a coating on it, and that's why I was just touching it a little bit at a time. Besides, it doesn't take much to take the material off. You'll take too much off like right away. So then I'll go ahead and go over here and check it, and I'll show you how we're going to do that. If you notice the way I did it too, you know, the wheel is spinning down, so you want to grind it aiming down, so that way any burrs are going to end up down here. You don't want chips and burrs. That's why I'll just kind of flex this a little bit. I'll flex it away from that wheel on this side so I don't hit it, and then I just touch this side to the wheel very slightly and easy. And then once I do that, I'll get a file and I'll just hit the file just a little bit, just to make sure there ain't no burrs, because if you have any burrs in there, you got to scratch the cylinder wall up. You don't want to do that. So I'm not going to do all of it. I'm just going to do right here on the edges, because all I'm doing is checking at this point. So I've already got one in here now. So basically, I'll just go ahead and pull this one out. I've got that one done already. That's the top ring. This is the bottom ring. All right, so I'm gonna just put this in here. Just kind of get it started. And then I'll usually use a piston with the ring on it. Try to get this ring where it touches the block all the way around and just push it down to the ring. And that way, when you push that ring down, it will be even. You don't want the ring cocked on one side or whatever, because it won't read right. And then I'll just check the gap. The gap is right there. And then I can already tell it's still too close. Like I say, these rings are actually a lot larger. And I don't want to take too much off at too soon. So I can tell it's definitely not even wide enough, so I'm not even going to check it. But this one here I have already done. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in there. So that's actually good. This is probably about 21 thousandths. So anyway, let me get the camera here so you can kind of get a peek. Just a little bit of a gap. And of course, if you happen to be running a blower, supercharger, turbo, whatever, there's a lot that goes into it. Kind of depends on cylinder pressure, compression, depends on the gap. You can just follow the manufacturer's instructions, when it comes to the rings or the pistons for that matter. But there's charts you can get on the internet. There's a formula that goes by piston size and everything, gives you the proper ring gap. So, like I said, we're doing 20 to 22 on the top. We're going to do 22 to 24 on the bottom ring. The bottom ring you always want a little bit larger than the top ring. Back in the day, it was the other way around. They used to say the bottom ring was smaller than the top ring. Well, they found out that by making the bottom ring a little larger than the top ring, you get some of the gases that escape from the top ring down through the bottom ring, and it actually makes more power. You actually can get more horsepower out of that. So, but yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm going to go ahead and finish gapping the rest of these rings. Once we get all the rings gapped, then I'm going to be putting them on the pistons, and we'll go ahead and start dropping the pistons in.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed those recordings from Dad. I know he put lots of tech tips in there and whatnot, so hope that you all learned something. We're going to go ahead and cut the video off here. Dad's going to go ahead and finish up putting all the pistons and rings in, and we'll pick up on another video after that. Get the rest of the engine assembled and start dropping it in and get the car running. So thank you all so much for watching. If you like what you saw and you want to see more on this build or any of the other builds we have going on in the shop, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon if you want to be notified whenever we post a video. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.